What we think comes next isn't Web 4 or 5, it's post-Web. So on the one hand, it's great to see all the noise around agents, it's like finally happening. But at the same time, a lot of VCs now even just have agent fatigue. DAOs are like nothing autonomous about any of them. But the minute that agents start using these things to coordinate, and they will reason, negotiate, vote, solve problems. And I think that's going to happen a lot quicker than people realize.
How would you recommend a retail investor try to kind of wrap their head around this space, especially as it pertains to like investing decisions?
The reality is...
Fantastic. Well, we're here with Jamie from Outlier, a super prolific VC accelerator in the space. But I'll let you introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. Yeah. So Jamie Burke, founder and now chairman of Outlier Ventures. And Outlier Ventures is 11 years old now.
Wow.
And we've been lots of different things over that journey, from a venture studio to then an incubator to now an accelerator.
Mm-hmm.
And actually we're also evolving that offering even a little bit more over the course of this year. But the core business is an accelerator. We were last year the most active accelerator in Web3 on the planet by deals done, which actually made us one of the most active investors. Of course, not by ticket size, because we're writing relatively modest tickets. But yeah, so very active. I think portfolios nearing 400 across all the kind of major categories. There are, of course, some themes. I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of Thesis. But you know, pretty much every country on the planet and most of the themes over that 400 we cover.
Right. Yeah, I think you have an interesting model, and I think like the prolificness of your model, it really benefits you, especially right now. And obviously, you guys are heavily embracing AI, but I think, you know, now more than ever, the barrier to entry to creating companies is lower.
Yeah.
And like in crypto, we've seen a lot of pretty nimble teams come from low amounts of capital, right? The mega round, I mean, it still exists, but you know, there's many examples over the last couple of years of smaller, you know, smaller funding rounds producing really incredible outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think like Outlier represents that, and the fact that you work with so many teams allows you to kind of like address a lot of these potential, you know, giants.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, founders are able to just do more with less now. Less venture capital, less people, actually, you know, especially as they begin to deploy agents into workflows. Again, something we'll probably talk about a little bit later.
Right.
But yeah, they can do more. And we talked about the idea of the 100x founder about a year ago. And, you know, we're starting to see it across the portfolio. Founders are using, it's kind of self-serving, actually. And so, you know, it's an interesting point for us as an accelerator, because historically we've had to do this 360 of pretty much everything of being a Web3 founder. And, you know, broadly, we kind of broke that down into the kind of risk areas for founders, apart from just being a founder, which is inherently risky, right? But in Web3, it's an order of magnitude more complex, because you need to understand the kind of technical risk of the stack that you're building on.
Right.
The business model risk, because that's not necessarily always clear. You know, are you building an equity business? What's tokenized? What's the relationship between those? Might you leverage some kind of DAO forms of governance? And then, of course, the regulatory risk, you know, of executing that in a compliant way. So we've had this team of people, which fluctuates from, you know, 75 to 100 people full time at Outlier, to give that 360 service offering as and when it's required, including things like token design and engineering, as well as all the usual stuff you'd expect from fundraising, go to market and stuff. But what's interesting is that, of course, you know, founders are now able to self-serve large parts of that, you know, whether it's spinning up a deck, you know, whether that's even kind of just automating aspects of fundraising. And so a big part now of us is helping founders understand how they can leverage, even if they might not identify as an AI startup per se, or DAI startup, just leveraging agentic workflows to be more effective.
Right. A big part of your job is identifying founders that will be successful, and you guys have been doing this for a very long time now. What does a successful founder look like, and how has that evolved over the last kind of 10 years?
Yeah, well, so I mean, look, the reality of investing at the stage that we invest at, broadly seed stage, sometimes we do pre-seed, but increasingly it's a little bit later, is that investing at that stage is part art and part science. And it's probably more art than it is science. It's science because there's just a math in the number of investments you need to make to be able to kind of tap into those outliers and those venture-like returns.
Right.
But it's art in that, a lot of the time you're imagining the potential of a founder. You're imagining what they're going to build, create, how they're going to be able to execute, because the reality is when they come in, they might have an MVP and not much else. As I said, we're now starting to go a little bit later because the kind of level of traction that's required to be able to now have a successful TGE, because there's just this wall of tokens coming to market, is just so much higher. But, the reality is you're kind of sat opposite a group of co-founders, and when they're pitching us, especially now, that what they're building might not even be the thing that they're building and executing on in 6 months, 10 months, 12 months.
Right.
And that's actually getting even more kind of compressed because, and again, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but one of the things that we're understanding in a world where the majority of the consumer internet and SaaS is going to be agentified, the startups won't look like startups in the near future. They won't necessarily be this equity-based company with a group of people that are going to solve like a whole category of problems over a decade, and you go on to like raise huge amounts of venture capital and list somewhere, or even necessarily kind of singularly launch a network. I think increasingly, founders we see it now, founders are coming and they have 3 agent startups. And so, and they don't know which one's going to stick, and they might be adjacent, they might not be, but they're already diversifying entrepreneurship in the way that investors diversify where they invest their capital.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think a lot about, especially in crypto, right? And you mentioned like founders having a risk on what chain they build. Mm-hmm. And in crypto, founders have to have multiple theses and make multiple kind of opinionated directional bets on various aspects of the project. So it's interesting you guys think about that as well.
Yeah. So, there's, I think venture capital is going to reinvent itself. And I think kind of classic startup theory about how assumptions about how you design, build, scale a startup are going to change because of the agentic internet. And so, we ourselves are always kind of having to reinvent what we do. As I said, we were a venture studio 11 years ago because there were no startups to invest in.
Right.
We'd speak to teams, they'd be pitching an application, but there was no infrastructure to execute that. And as you well probably know, most Web3 startups, start at some commercial problem, application problem, and end up becoming an infrastructure company or a middleware company because they had to solve all these technical problems.
Right.
Now, of course, that's changing, and increasingly people are being able to apply this to kind of particular commercial problems. But so, we were just a venture studio, and we started to kind of learn by doing and breaking stuff, and this was in the early days of Ethereum, and understanding the technical limitations of what was and wasn't possible. And that allowed us to time horizon investments. And very quickly, we just realized there's a huge amount of infrastructure that needed to be built. So we became an incubator, which was much more like a deep tech approach. It's like multi-year engagement, solving very, very technical problems at the infrastructure layer and kind of core primitives. And then as the infrastructure started to mature, we felt, okay, people can potentially begin to deploy this stuff. And that's when we became an accelerator, which was, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe even 7 years ago. And now we're at a different inflection point. As we're looking at this market, we're looking at the nature of what is a startup changing, how it's going to be financed. And so, we're asking ourselves, like, what does an accelerator look like in agentic internet? What of our business as a knowledge economy company, beyond the deployment of capital, as an advisor, what of that needs to be agentified? And like, what's our value proposition? What are the things that you need a person to be doing, and what can be automated? So it's a really interesting moment. And the exciting thing and the challenging thing about being in Web3 is you can't stop innovating. Like, the minute you kind of start thinking like an incumbent, you're kind of dead in the water.
Mm-hmm. One interesting thing is your guys' kind of reputation towards like application and product, and you guys are very much and I'm not sure if you think of yourselves internally this way, but I very much think of you guys as a business that really embraces like applications and products. I just talked to Rushi from Movement yesterday, and he kind of talked about this idea of like an infrastructure premium.
Mm-hmm.
Why have you guys kind of gone have made this shift from like infrastructure to more kind of application product based businesses, even though we've seen that like there have been relatively few breakthrough products in Web3?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting that you have that perspective, because I wouldn't say, if I kind of look across our portfolio of like 400 startups and were to segment it, based upon where they are in the stack, that it necessarily biases to the application layer. But it's interesting, people always have like slightly different perspectives on what they think we do. And
Right.
And I'm not necessarily sure why, to be honest with you. It could just be the bias of the lens that they're kind of looking at the portfolio.
I guess for me, it might be just kind of like the idea of like, when we think about crypto infrastructure, like it's these like mega rounds, they're raising $1 billion for, it's like the AI16Z mega round, right?
Sure.
Or sorry, A16Z.
Sure.
And since you guys are investing like in seed, for whatever reason, I sometimes associate that with more kind of like application.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, for sure, we definitely do kind of have. I mean, I'm going to guess maybe like 1/3 or slightly over 1/3 might be at the application layer. But we've done a lot of infrastructure. It has been like the better known ones are perhaps more historical. So like Fetch.ai, I mean, that was a pre-seed investment.
Wow.
In 2017. We were literally the first ticket.
Wow.
In fact, I actually gave them the name Fetch.ai. I went and bought the URL for them because they were called UView or something. I was like, that's awful. Here's a URL, you should use that.
Right.
And of course, they've gone on to, I mean, to hazard a guess, they were definitely the first agentic protocol and probably one of the first DAI investments. And we did IOTA, similar time period, which was one of the first machine-to-machine economy, like deep-in projects. Again, before that was a category. So we have done a lot of infrastructure, and we continue to do a lot of that at the deep-in layer. We're actually just in the middle of probably closing applications for our third deep-in accelerator program. We did our first official DAI one last year. And as we kind of look at the agentic internet mainstreaming now, I would categorize a lot of the investments that we are making or looking to make as forms of infrastructure. They're kind of core primitives that will enable the agentic internet to function, like the coordination layer or kind of semantic layer. And so we're fairly agnostic. And, we're fairly opportunistic, so sometimes we have quite a broad thesis just to see, like, if there's a particular domain area that we're wanting to learn about, then it will be deliberately broad. And then we'll see what comes through, and that will help refine the thesis as we kind of roll out other programs. And that's actually one of the really cool things for us about the scale that we have, both in terms of the new startups that we're looking to accelerate and the kind of inbound deal flow that we see, as well as this kind of scale of the portfolio that we've got, is that that's lots of data points. And like ultimately, venture capital is, understanding patterns, doing pattern recognition, placing some bets to kind of get feedback on how this stuff's being applied, where it's not working, where it is working, where you're getting traction. And so, we do a lot of DD. We speak to a lot of teams. We invest in sub 1% of them,
Wow.
but still, make relatively large amount of investments at an industry level. But that just gives us a good understanding of trends that are about to hit venture a little bit earlier. And the goal really is actually this kind of Goldilocks zone, because as an accelerator, you need to be a bit earlier than everybody else, but you can't be too early, because if the teams graduate the program in 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, they're looking to fundraise, and wider venture hasn't understood that paradigm yet, they're not ready to deploy capital, then you have teams that are going to struggle to raise, and you'll have a higher fail rate. So the kind of the Goldilocks zone is like 3 to 6 months ahead of where venture capital proper is going to be looking to deploy. And then a big part of our job is to kind of help frame a thesis to contextualize those startups. Like, why have we invested? How might other investors perform fundamental analysis on them, in order that the life cycle of these teams they can unlock stages of funding.
Right. I think one thing too about like pre-seed seed investing that's quite interesting to me, and you guys have like pioneered the cohort, like the thematic, I don't know how you refer to this internally, but like the thematic cohort, right? Where it's like DeepIn, or I know you've had like AI and Agentic cohorts.
Yeah.
And it's like you often have ended up acting as almost like an influencer on like the narrative direction of the space, right? Because you identify something and then produce a bunch of companies that are working in this direction, and it kind of like affects the landscape of the ecosystem.
Sometimes, I mean that's the goal anyway, and sometimes it cuts through and sometimes it doesn't. I remember, so we actually published what we call the Convergence Thesis. I think it was in 2018, and that was based upon the investments we were making into Fetch.ai, Ocean Protocol, IOTA at the time, all broadly based upon the convergence of DLT with AI and IoT. Now, it took, until probably last year for DAI to even really be a thing, and DeepIn maybe the year before. So arguably, we were way too early then, and I remember having conversations with some very large VCs that I won't name, pitching Fetch to them, and they were just like, "Dude, this is sci-fi." And in the context of their fund life cycle, it was, probably would have been a little bit too early for them to deploy, but based on those investments and being in the trenches, working with these guys, solving technical problems, it became very clear to me that in an AI context, all roads lead to Web3. Because if you wanted AI at scale, you wanted something that looked and felt like AGI, then most likely that wouldn't be solved through a monolithic stack. It would need to be solved through agentic systems. Agentic systems need to be coordinated. You need verifiability. You need deterministic characteristics. And so, well, what does that? And of course, they need machine money. So we had a very, very strong thesis. We were highly convicted of it, but it was like way too early for wider venture. And it's only now really that's coming through. So we were right, but that didn't necessarily make it easier. We weren't able to affect the narrative at that point. And it didn't necessarily make it easier for those teams we invested in. They had to survive several years to be in vogue. So, I mean, the goal is to help translate what we're seeing happen at pre-seed seed, and give our venture network kind of a heads up and help inform their thesis. And as I said, for them to be able to know, well, how would you do fundamental analysis? But at the same time, as crypto is so narrative driven, that narrative now is the kind of cycles are just that much more aggressive. So I mean, it's the goal, and similarly with the post web, which I guess we'll talk about. This is our latest attempt to frame the trends that we're seeing from both pre-seed and this maturing portfolio now, investments that we made 7 years ago,
Right.
and translate the implications of that to the wider market, to other founders, to VCs, to cut through a lot of the hype around agents at the moment. So on the one hand, it's great to see all the noise around agents. It's like finally happening. But at the same time, I think a lot of VCs now even just have agent fatigue. They're just like, you know what, I've made some investments. I still really don't know how this is going to play out rightly, by the way. And I'm just going to sit back and watch.
Right.
And that's the difference between us and a VC typically is, well, so firstly, we invest off our balance sheet. So we're not a GPLP. So we can make any bet that we want at any stage in any life cycle, which gives us opportunity to kind of, invest in different time horizons. Where for, classic VC, they've got LPs, the fund has to deploy a certain amount of money within a certain period of time, but they also have the privilege of being able to not invest. Like we've got 80 people set up to invest, right? So we're always on investing. And actually, in the kind of last bear market, we were the most active investor on the planet in Web3. Everyone else is just like, oh, we're not deploying into this.
Right.
And, on the one hand, we kind of had to because we were set up for it. But at the same time, we saw an opportunity in that, right? For us to unlock outsized returns, outsized stakes in networks. And so, it's an interesting, like the venture capital life cycle in Web3 it's not very mature yet, we still don't have a lot of like liquid funds. I think there's a lot more of those starting to come online now, positioning for market consolidation. But we also kind of have to try to adapt, like where and when we want to deploy capital, and also point this machine that we've got of lots of people.
You mentioned like an early AI thesis, I think around like 2018. How has that thesis evolved over time?
So I mean, on the one hand, it's like fundamentals haven't. They're kind of still very much this idea that AI needs Web3, and in particular, agentic forms of AI need this coordination layer. They need verifiability. They need deterministic property. So that's that's happening now. I think perhaps the thing that is a new realization over the last 12 months was that we needed more natural language interfaces and LLMs to make Web3 usable. So it's not just that Web3 fixes a lot of problems for AI, it's that AI as a kind of interface solves a lot of problems for Web3.
Right.
And actually, all this stuff that we've been building for the last decade collectively as an industry that we've called Web3 didn't really actually have much web in it. It was more like this internet functionality of like digital property rights and smart contract deterministic nature and all this kind of stuff, but it was just not usable by people. But actually, when you shift to thinking the primary user is agents, it makes a lot of sense, right? Agents love logic. They love incentive games. They can handle complexity. They can operate DAOs. And so actually, we kind of had all this like dormant infrastructure, like waiting for a user.
Right.
And that user's agents. And so it's actually both of them that now create a really, really powerful flywheel. So much so that I think it actually changes the very nature of the consumer internet. And so what we think comes next isn't Web 4 or 5, it's the post-web. So we actually think the web, from search engines to comparison websites to an app for everything or a website for everything, and the advertising model, the interruptive advertising model that drives it all, that all largely disappears because agents just don't need that stuff, And as we task agents to carry out work on our behalf through delegation, they just bypass it. And so actually what's left is like a very thin web. And that web also, like these interfaces, are just going to be generated on the fly by AI for us, specific, like hyper contextual. And so the way that we're actually thinking about this is there's a couple of aspects. The first one is that agents allow us to go from read, write, own to read, write, own, delegate. But actually it's that delegation that unlocks the own part, digital property rights that people aren't really enjoying at scale. But so much so that the big shift ultimately is from the attention economy to the intention economy. So if you think about the consumer internet today, and I don't know if you're familiar with the paperclip maximizer concept, but Nick Bostrom, who I believe was one of the person to first refer to it as at least artificial superintelligence. He might have been artificial general intelligence. I can't recall now. But he said, look, if you give an algorithm a task to optimize for a particular thing, it will do that to the sacrifice of everything else. And so the idea was, if you say maximize making paperclips, I don't know why I said paperclips, but this was the thing, then algorithms would destroy the planet to make paperclip factories,
Yeah.
And I think actually, if you think about the consumer internet today, it's a perfect example of a paperclip maximizer, but where the optimization function is attention. So we're all wandering around like really distracted. Sometimes you just find yourself, I've just been like scrolling in this app for an hour. I don't know what I've been doing.
Right.
It's been like with no purpose. There's been no like outcome. And that's because everything's optimized for capturing attention, locking it into apps, and then trying to just extract some value. And the whole consumer internet is organized around optimizing for that at the sacrifice of like our sanity, our mental health. But actually, ironically, the business model that subsidizes that, a lot of these free web services, is supposed to be advertising. But advertising conversion rates are like less than 2%. So you're doing all this. And by the way, the carbon footprint of the attention economy is the same as the global aviation industry. So if you just think about all the resources that are going into this mindless attention thing, and the outcome is like 2% conversion rate on adverts. So like clearly as a paradigm doesn't work. But most importantly for us is like putting the ethical arguments aside, if you were to flip that on its head and you were to say the internet starts optimizing for intention, so solving our intentions as effectively and efficiently as possible, then agents will just remove and bypass the attention economy. And what happens is, because a lot of this stuff's going to be built on Web3 infrastructure, it's our belief, you end up moving away from a maximally extractive system with suboptimal outcomes to one where you have optimal outcomes with minimal extraction. Because again, agents don't like rent seeking. If you've got a profit that's too big, it will find a solution that's cheaper, and somebody else will offer it to undercut it. So that is a huge shift in terms of the consumer internet. But the problem with all that stuff is that for founders, you are now operating in an internet that ruthlessly removes inefficiencies. There are no product moats because the UX is just spun up on the fly.
Right.
You don't have the same benefit of network effects. There's no such thing as loyalty, really. Brands start to mean less. Like an agent doesn't care about a brand. And so a lot of the kind of classic startup theory that people, even in Web3, are still using to build startups to a degree, disappears. And so the question is, well, what does building a startup in this environment look like? because it's going to be hyper disruptive. A lot of business models that we're seeing today that are agent based kind of make sense now, but you can see that's just going to be commoditized really, really quickly. Like it's a race to zero. And it was interesting, kind of founder came up and pitched me at our event a couple of days ago, and it's within the food delivery space, and it's all agentified, and they charge the user zero.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no point in me charging anything because somebody else will just do it. So their starting point is zero.
Right.
And so they're having to come up with, they were basically a payments company. So they're just making, a bit on the transactions.
Exactly.
And the application is to just get the volume on the transactions, but they're not charging anything to anybody for the rest of the stack.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you said, where it's like, we created this content machine. The only reason it works for a Facebook is because it's accessible to all 7 billion people because of the mass leverage I can put into this machine and then extract a little bit. It's a similar model, except it eliminates the superfluousness of it.
Yeah.
It's like I'm gonna do a similar thing where it's like I don't want to I want to address the widest market as possible and then take a little bit, but it's instead of a rent-seeking behavior with this massive inefficiency, it's like an efficient behavior and extracting a little bit.
Exactly, yeah. And what's interesting is the mental model that we're trying to encourage founders to use is to move away from, firstly, even company building, and to think that they're effectively solving typically a class of problem. There's a group of problems that need to be solved somehow. And to do that, most likely is going to be delivered by a system, most likely a multi-agent system.
Mm-hmm.
But a multi-agent system to function needs APIs, SDKs, data, certain AI models, inference, compute. There's a lot of resources that are going to go into the agentic internet solving for kind of these classes of problems to give web services. And so the role of a founder is to find system alignment, system fit. So rather than product market fit, it's system fit. And actually the thing that will drive these systems are incentives because they're agentic. And so what's interesting is token design becomes really relevant now. So for the last several years, we've been building incentive games using tokens for people. The problem is people are not logical.
Right.
They're irrational. And they're pretty stupid. They can't handle complexity, especially a token for everything. So if I've got to play some token game for every single layer of the stack, it's just not reasonable expectation for a human being, right? No matter how clever you are. But for agents, it's super cool, right? Agents will follow breadcrumbs of incentives and as a consequence, you end up with this very emergent behavior from the system. So token design, actually token engineering, I think becomes the way you can build moats and network effects to aggregate agents as users, to carry out, collaborate, to create platform-like solutions for users. And I say platform-like because it's not so obvious what a platform looks like in an agentic internet. Is it a swarm? Is it a hive? If it's a hive, well, how do you encourage agents to behave in hierarchical structures and versus just randomly do shit that they think is interesting or rewarding or so there's just a huge amount of open questions. It's very complex to think through. So as if things weren't already complex enough for Web3 founders, now it's well, you're probably not building a startup. You're probably not going to fund it conventionally with venture capital. You're probably not going to hire 100 people. You're going to have to create loads of agent workflows. And then you're going to have to somehow find system fit. Either you're designing a system and then it's around coordinating that system, or you're going to participate in the system. And then you have to think about system fit and the value you're going to be adding to it. So It really truly is an entirely new paradigm. And I think that most founders and definitely most like VCs haven't quite got the right mindset yet. And so I think there's going to be a lot of capital that's going to go into, well, firstly, time founders, because that's the most scarce thing. There's lots of capital. Like if you're a founder, you've only got so much time on this planet.
Right.
A lot of time is going to go into building things that are just disrupted. Like the disruptor will be disrupted in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. There's going to be a lot of capital that will go into trying to build companies in the agentic internet that just won't exist.
Right. I think with that, right, there's a danger where, like, again, you're too early or you're over indexed on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Like we're in such an abstract place where it feels like we don't even know how this thing will play out, but you have like this strong conviction beliefs. A good example here would be like a lot of people still debate whether like value will even be captured at like the LLM level, right?
Yeah.
Like open AI, is that even going to be worth it? Is it, open source, closed source? Like there's all these debates in here, yet you guys are making like really strong conviction bets in really specific categories. Like how do you justify it, and is it possible that you guys are like completely positioned the wrong way if there's some new development?
Yeah. Well, so on the one hand, we're like generally convicted, right? So we are largely operating in like known unknowns. So we have a set of questions, and actually most of the investments that we're making now are ways of answering those questions. And through founders' endeavor of like trying to solve problems, pivoting all over the place, and then hopefully at some point finding like fit. So we definitely don't think we've got like the answers. We kind of got this parts. So we refer to this as the post web, and the post web is comprised of these converging technologies. Like lower down, you've kind of got the more infrastructure, coordinated compute, data storage, memory, like whatever it is. You've then got the kind of application layer, which is a bit broader than how you might conventionally think of applications. It includes DeFi because there are more functional applications that just agents use. There's no people using them. And then you kind of have the agentic layer, and you move up to like wallets, which begin to represent more complex forms of personhood. That could include your kind of your prompt library and like this kind of very localized memory. It could include how you access your social graph. But one of the things that we're thinking through is like where, like just first principles, where might there be moats, and where do we think it's most likely to get disrupted? And so, for example, we think that the closer you go to human in the loop, the more predictable it gets, because people generally aren't going to change very much, right? So where there is the requirement for a person to make a decision, like human in the loop, just because it's the preference of the user or there's a regulatory compliance part to it, the human will bring biases, and those biases will be represented in their agents. So even though an agent could in theory get optimal outcomes, the more they're representing the biases of the user, you'll get suboptimal. And that there's business models in human inefficiency. And those will look a little bit more familiar to the web as we know it today, like classic startup theory. The minute you start going to agent, like all bets are off, because they just start doing really complex things. I don't know if you've seen the video that flew past a few days ago where they had two agents talking to one another. One was a call center agent, and one was I figure it wasn't. It might have been ChatGPT or something, and he kind of programmed it to kind of, and they just started talking in a completely different language when they realized they were both AI. Now, I'm not sure it was real, but it will definitely be real at some point. They'll realize that they don't need even our language. It's an inefficient way to effectively solve a problem.
Yeah.
So, that's a bit of a black box. It's going to be very, very emergent behavior. And that's where it's harder to predict, and to make investments now. So that's one example. But then there are things like network effects. So we've begun to so if you consider that agents don't need to use DLT, the assumption is it's very helpful. It's verifiability and, as we said, determinism. But DLT brings usually a cost. And again, sometimes agents want to do things really, really quickly and cheaply. And so to encourage them, to incentivize them to do something on DLT, there have to be certain conditions in place, certain trust assumptions. Otherwise, the economics of it just won't work, or the throughput and performance of it won't work. And so we think agents will, if they're using DLT, in most cases, they'll prefer more optimistic type trust-based assumptions and ways of forming consensus because they're cheaper. And so the fewer trust mechanisms they need to manage counterparty risk in the system and stuff like that, the cheaper it is, the faster it is. And as a consequence, the greater the network effect. It's very difficult if you're bootstrapping a marketplace, doesn't matter what it is, right? It could be compute or it could be something else. If no parties in that marketplace trust one another, you have to introduce these costly trust mechanisms, whether it's staking or forms of escrow or proofs, because otherwise, how can one entity trust another entity? Well, they can't. But the minute that you have a certain level of density in that network and a certain volume of transaction, you're effectively pinging all these different actors, and the system will know you as actor, if we want to carry out transaction, you're probably going to behave as a good actor.
Right.
And so, you know what, with this person, Jamie, you want to transact with them, you don't need all this cost. And we can rectify the problem later. And so to achieve that state, that optimistic state, takes a certain level of network effect. And so as a consequence, if you're trying to spin up a competing network, even though technically you could do that, it's probably going to be open source, you don't have the density of network to be able to be more optimistic in nature. And so we think that there will be some first mover advantage to those that can just bring on, have gravity to the network that sucks in assets and volume, because they can then just become more optimistic in nature. So there's some things like this which probably aren't generally true, but start to give you a little bit of directional steer on, okay, well, like some first principles. Do we think network effects can be achieved here? Do we think there's a moat because of human biases or not?
Yeah, well, an interesting point here, a lot of really crypto infrastructure is about eliminating trust. That's kind of one of the core premises of this. However, you're talking about an agentic system where, since agents are much more rational than humans, maybe, they are inherently trusting because they understand that from a game theoretical perspective, this is the optimal way to behave.
Yes.
So isn't there in that an opportunity or an option for the future to not need the trust mechanisms that we as an industry have decided are more necessary?
So I don't think so, and the reason is because actually it's a bit of an arms race. So you would imagine that there are going to be many malicious agents out to game the system. And they'll be very advanced, and they could be criminal actors, they could be state actors. I mean, who knows?
Right.
But they'll be explicitly there to game the system, and so there's this very evolutionary environment where there's forms of competition, there's forms of collaboration. There'll be ways of the system policing itself somehow.
Right. It's adaptive.
Yeah, but it's always going to be in a state of adaptation. And so actually, even when you're thinking about token design, currently token design is very static. You kind of think of your token design, you have your optimizing function, and the assumption is generally the system's going to stay the same, and you're trying to balance out behaviors, positive behaviors and negative behaviors. But the reality is that because There'll be like vampire attacks. There's a lot of analogous stuff that's happened in DeFi that I think we're going to start seeing play out in the agentic space.
Wow.
Where you're kind of attacking a network for liquidity or whatever, governance attacks in like very rudimentary form that we've seen in like DeFi. That shit's just going to go prime time in the agentic internet. And that's going to be a constant state. So I don't think you can necessarily assume that agents will be positively rational, because there'll be a very strong rationale for them to sometimes be malicious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that tokenomic question is interesting. I was talking with a stablecoin startup, and they were like, well, we have these juiced APRs, but we can't get users because no one's interested. No one is looking for farms. But once the agents come around, they'll be maximally efficient, and we know that they'll be seeking out this APR, right?
Yeah.
And my thought was like, well, isn't the whole purpose of this to like bootstrap your stablecoin? And if these like DeFi agents that are all looking to kind of maximally extract can farm you, they will for a period of time, but then they'll go away the moment that you're not incentivizing them to do this.
That's right.
And I think some of the stickiness of products in Web3 today is because like I'm familiar with the interface, I'm familiar with the product, I like it. All my tokens are already on your platform or whatever.
Laziness.
An agent doesn't behave that way.
No, that's it. I mean, much of the web today is based upon human laziness, right? We want shortcuts. Like, what is a brand? It's a shortcut. Okay, it's Coca-Cola, or it's like
right.
It's Four Seasons. Like, because people are distracted, and we largely look for shortcuts to make decisions. And good enough is normally okay, right? We're not actually. Very few people are trying to make like the best possible outcome. Most of us are like, okay, that's good enough based upon the value or importance of that decision, and I've got to get on to this other stuff. And because of the attention economy, we're just permanently distracted. So actually, attention is even poorer. And so yeah, we get locked into products just through familiarity, which is a moat. That's a product moat. But again, like agents don't need that. Like they will, and it won't necessarily be that they'll always be optimizing for like a very kind of transactional outcome. There might be other things, for example, which is, let's say there are two systems, one's cheaper than the other one, but by participating in the more expensive one, your agent somehow earns an improved reputation, which then lowers the cost across other systems. And so it can then potentially make a calculation. All right, well, this one-off transaction is more expensive, but there's going to be a bigger gain by me switching system, earning some points, being a good boy over here. Again, like it's very difficult to predict how all that works. Now, to flip that on its head, there will be some things where an agent might bring back some options. Hey, here's 3 options. But ultimately, it's the human making the decision, and they'll pick the one they've heard of before. So, here are 3 lending protocols, but I've heard of Aave, so yeah, go with that.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily that all that's entirely removed. There will most likely always be a human in the loop at some point. And so where there's a human in the loop, there's a bias, there's a business model.
Do you think like the life cycle of the products and companies themselves will shrink as these these agents can maximally kind of like hop from one thing to the other, figure out how to game the system in a quicker way?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the crazy thing is that much of this stuff will be generated on the fly. So like most websites or web experiences, like it'll just be generated for you on the fly based upon your preferences, based on the mode you're in. So if I'm walking down the street, it's like just a voice note right in my earpod, versus if it knows I've got a bit of downtime and then it gives me a bit more immersion, on whatever device I've got. And it's also interesting when you start to think about that there are explicit intents and there are implicit intents. So explicit intents are pretty easy, right? Like I want this now on these parameters, and my agent effectively auctions that out to a marketplace, looks at the options, and then makes a recommendation. But an implicit one is assuming that we will have forms of sovereign AI, which again I think Web3 can help deliver. That might be local, on device. It might be another kind of way of being implemented. But whatever it is, it's an agent that's mine. It serves me only, provably, and I'm happy for it to know everything, like always on. It's like Alexa, but it's not Amazon at the other end. And I'm happy for it to just listen to me and then infer needs. And at certain points where I'm in the right mood, it will say, hey, you know what, Jamie, I've sensed you're a bit down at the moment. Maybe you want to go and see this movie. And,
right.
Like, okay, well, that's interesting. Give me the options, what are the times? And so there will be a difference between like implicit and explicit. I think the implicit ones are most interesting in a way because it's a bit less transactional, probably requires more immersion. Okay, yeah, well, like, can you show me the trailer, or I don't know, whatever it is. But increasingly, a lot of this stuff will be happening like locally or at the edge, and even to power those experiences, I think you'll be using decentralized forms of compute and all this kind of stuff, like really at the edge. So that the cloud infra that will even execute all this stuff will be optimized, will be assembled basically at the point of consumption by the agentic internet. And I can even imagine there'll be like bring your own data for final mile execution, or bring your own compute, or bring your own memory and resources. So on the one hand, I imagine people that are listening to this who haven't yet really thought about the agentic stuff, it's another one of those moments where people are like, okay, sure, like in 10 years' time. And in some ways, that's true. But in other ways, I think it's going to happen a lot quicker. Like, I think DAOs are a really great example of this. Decentralized autonomous organizations, like we just know that there's never been one of those that's existed so far. There's like nothing autonomous about any of them.
Right.
They're Discord servers primarily, and it's very analog. People are having conversations, they're kind of making a decision offline, and they're executing it on chain. But there's nothing autonomous about it. But the minute that agents start using these things to coordinate, using LLMs to talk to one another, I'm seeing a load of those being pitched at the moment, where you'll have specialist agents with certain domain expertise, and they'll talk to one another through LLMs that will then be auditable, and they will reason, negotiate, vote, solve problems, coordination problems. And I think that's going to happen a lot quicker than people realize. And when agents can transact, negotiate, cooperatize, forms of permanent or ad hoc cooperatives, manage resources, deploy resources, that starts to get pretty wild pretty quickly.
Yeah, you've done a better job than anyone I've ever talked to about this kind of agentic world, about like establishing specific areas of like interest, right? Or there's going to be this emergent behavior here, or this is going to be a phenomenon that we haven't seen before. A lot of the people who listen to this are retail investors. Like, how would you suggest that? Like, it just feels so complex and inaccessible, and it's like I don't even know, I don't know when this is going to happen. I don't know how involved. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to, you talk about agents communicating a different language. Like, what is even to be built for that? Like, how do you think about that as how would you recommend a retail investor try to kind of wrap their head around this space, especially as it pertains to like investing decisions?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the reality is, as a professional investor with 80 other professionals just doing this all day long, it's complex for us. So I don't think there's any way around that, and it's very difficult to predict. I mean, hopefully, we release our thesis and frameworks. It's primarily oriented towards founders to navigate, but you can go to, so aside from our website, you go to postweb.io.
Mm-hmm.
We're producing loads of research papers. We've got some audio books to just like theorize around this stuff.
Right.
Again, like depending upon the kind of technical understanding, some of that may or may not be accessible. But the key thing is, as I was trying to say, there's some first principles, and I actually think that for us, I found in conversation this post-web framing is helpful because we're all consumers of the internet, and we all intuitively feel that we're using Google less and we're using ChatGPT more. But that's just the discovery part of using the consumer internet.
Mm-hmm.
But then you start thinking, well, am I using comparison websites as much? That'll be the next thing. No, actually, I'm just getting some recommendations and I'm going with that one. So a lot of this stuff will just become very intuitive, and it's largely abstracting away things. It's like from the human experience, it's actually just removing things.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is then what's happening behind the curtain, and where might agents, how might agents operate? And how might I, as a consumer, be interacting with an agent? What are the things that I want from my agent versus like, a Meta agent or an Amazon agent? So hopefully, like the more that people go down that like post-web rabbit hole, some of it's intuitive. But I think like more broadly, if we kind of just step back from the agentic internet for a second, then we just think about crypto as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
as a capital market. We are now at the stage where there is an exponential supply of digital assets because agents are spinning them up now. Okay, most of them are useless and
Right.
AI meme coins, but if you look at the number of digital assets, I go back 11 years ago. Each year, like the number of digital assets, whether it's an NFT or a governance token or a utility token or a meme coin, we've gone from like hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. But if you chart that out, it's now gone exponential in the last 12 months.
Right.
So the problem for retail is the same problem for exchanges, and it's the same problem for VC. It is impossible to navigate that. It's a fire hose of tokens.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you could perform fundamental analysis on them, like to form a thesis, but well, which one? And the problem is because you've got this near infinite supply of digital assets now, demand's never going to catch up with that. So demand is diffuse, which is why I think, putting aside macro stuff at the moment, the crypto market is in the state that it's in.
Right.
Because capital can't stick. It's just literally going around in this even like hourly cycles.
Right. Like the euthanasia roller coaster times infinity.
Yeah. So, and so that it's like just a dysfunctional market. And so the first thing that has to happen for all of us is that there needs to be better mechanisms for curation and then for consolidation. And the problem for retail is the same problem for Coinbase. I think Brian recently said they don't know how to list stuff anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like what should they list? Like, it's not obvious the amount of tokens that are trying to get listed. They just can't even. I mean, they're probably going to get agents to figure it out, by the way, but they just can't even handle it, right? And they're however many people. So I believe what has to happen is new mechanisms for making a more orderly capital market, and guess what the solution to that is? Agents. So we're already starting to see this, right? Agentic VC DAOs, agentic hedge fund DAOs, agentic accelerators, agentic incubators, all open source frameworks and models, which will allow individuals to basically join a community, and have that curation, that fundamental analysis done, and the capital allocated on their behalf. So I suspect what that will mean for a lot of individuals like retail out there is, they'll join particular communities based on, particular interests, that will help automate how they allocate capital.
Right. So it's almost like instead of looking for winners, there's just like centers of gravity that like people are attracting, community, a point of value, an identity or something.
I
Right?
think so. And then like the next thing, I mean, if you look at what's analogous into, TradFi, traditional capital markets, they have indices, right? So if you can't pick a winner, you pick you index something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now that index will say, okay, like DePIN's interesting. DePIN's definitely a thing. It's got real world income. In theory, DePIN assets should decouple from wider crypto at some point, or at least have a more natural floor in a bear market because they are revenue generating. And as long as the world needs AI and compute, well, a decentralized compute network has value. So let's say that's the thesis. It's certainly one of our theses for DePIN, right? But let's say as a retail, well, okay, I buy that thesis, I buy DePIN's a thing, but like, how do I pick which one? How do I perform fundamental analysis? Well, I can't. But there's this DAO over here, and it has this way of balancing a basket of tokens, and maybe there's a junior index and a senior index, and the junior index is a bit more risky, but more upside, and the senior index is like the leading DePIN projects by nodes, by transaction volume. And I just put some money into that, and it does the balancing, it does the fundamental analysis, it handles the complexity. Now, the really cool thing with this is that I think this will take us to systems that are based upon fundamental analysis, which arguably there's no point doing at the moment. I mean, we do fundamental analysis because we have to.
Mm-hmm.
Our businesses, we make an investment, we get an advisory allocation that will vest over several years. So we really need to we have to have a conviction that this thing will actually have some value at some point.
Right.
And beyond just whatever's hot in this cycle. Because, even if it's hot in this cycle, but it's not hot in the next one, well, that's when we get our tokens. So it's not helpful for us to be momentarily hot, right?
Right.
I think the minute that you have agents performing fundamental analysis, the industry starts allocating capital, like the market as a whole starts allocating capital on actual fundamental analysis. Mm-hmm. And when the primary user are agents that start following the logic of incentive games, all of a sudden, I think you get a much more orderly capital market. Now, I'm an optimist. Like, I think you just got to be in this space and to be a VC in this space. But I think that's how we go towards a capital market that allocates capital to like real innovation, real adoption, and we kind of get out of the Ponzinomics, like this kind of financial nihilism that we're in at the moment.
It's really wild. It almost reminds me, some of the things you're saying almost remind me of like and like something like similar to capitalism, right? Where it's like directed, capitalism solves itself, right? Capital is incentivized to flow to the places where it's productive. That's the whole concept of capitalism. It's almost like because this universe of agentic AI is incentivized to solve problems for whoever, systems, other agents, human beings, that there's a new economy that's almost like instead of capital, it's like this I don't even know how to describe it, but this like post web. Right?
Right. Yeah. And that's and what's interesting about this actually, and you kind of nailed it on the head, is that, and for me this was the thing that always excited me about Web3, is that it has the potential to reconcile 100 years plus of these historically competing forces, right? You had free market fundamentalism, but left unchecked would kind of, misbehave and misalign with like people's consumer interest.
Right.
So that's why you needed antitrust and you needed regulation. But then, and forms of corporatization, so forming cooperatives and forming unions. But then, and you had this kind of constant tension, taken to the extreme, you've got communism, and taken to the extreme, you've got like liberalism and this kind of free market capitalism.
Right.
The potential in this space is you reconcile both of those things, because you have the sovereign individual, you have fluid collectivism, and you have free market fundamentalism, where in theory everything has a price. Even intangible things can be quantified. So reputation, you can put a price, you can tokenize that now, you have a price on it, you can collateralize it, you can invest attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually this kind of reconciles all those things to create a kind of meta super agentic economy. There's a few people that call it the computable economy. Everything's computable, everything's a data input.
Right.
I mean, yeah, we kind of think we haven't got a name for it yet. Let's call it computable economy. But for us, that is a natural conclusion. I don't know when, like what time horizon, but it is a natural conclusion to the post-web.
Right. It's like in the same way that capitalism like posits to solve itself. Like this is a system that will fix the issues of the system internally. It's the same thing,
yes,
but we're utilizing AI.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Awesome. Jamie, it's been a pleasure. It's been a wild and wide-ranging conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.